Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to briefly, introduce the wonderful initiative at New America that this conversation will be housed under. New America's Planetary Politics Initiative is a call to action for reimagining a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable global order as our world becomes more uncertain, hotter, wetter, and just more complex. So this is the time to build new institutions that are attuned to today's environment in preparation for the uncertainties that tomorrow may hold. I have the pleasure of being here to chat with Ernest Scheider about his book, The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. A little bit about myself. I'm a senior fellow here working at New America under the Planetary Politics Initiative. I'm working on just energy transition. I'm also a visiting assistant professor at the Pratt Institute's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment, where I teach environmental economics. I spent the last 15 years helping NGOs, think tanks, and businesses unpack a lot of the different issues around climate, environmental justice, resource conflict, and sustainable development. And I'm joined today with Ernest, who is an award-winning journalist, author, and senior correspondent for Reuters. He's a native of Maine, so he's from a very climate secure place. I'm from Florida, so I'm from a very climate insecure place. But Ernest's interest in journalism began when he founded his high school's newspaper. He went on to attend the University of Maine and Columbia's journalism school. He joined the AP as a business reporter in 2007 at the perfect moment to be reporting on business right before the fall of Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, and helped to chronicle those early days of the global financial crisis. Since he joined Reuters in 2009, Ernest has uniquely been reporting very deeply on the two biggest energy transitions of our time, the US shale oil revolution and the clean energy shift that's happening right now. This book, The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives, has been widely acclaimed. It's published by One Signal Publishers under Simon and Schuster. This book really presents a uniquely human-focused narrative exploring the people who live on energy transition's front lines, and as we need to think more critically about the critical minerals and supply chains that we all rely on for our technology as well as for our energy transition. This standout nonfiction work did make the long list for the 2024 National Book Award for Nonfiction. I have to say it's among the best nonfiction books I've read this year, so highly recommend going and purchasing it and clicking to purchase the link that's provided. I mean, in the War Below, Ernest goes all around the country as well as some different spots across the globe to interview industry titans, conservationists, community groups, policymakers, and all kinds of other folks in between. And it's just a really great book, and it underpins how the energy transition is about far more than the number of EVs that, metaphorically grow on trees. It's about the critical resources that will power that transition, and how we need to think about where these things come from. The overarching themes of this book are community and choice, and yeah, highly recommend it. Just if you have been living under a rock and don't know what's happening in the world, we're at this unique moment in the policy space where a lot of the finance, energy transition, and critical resources pieces are starting to actually get talked about as cross-cutting issues instead of siloed issues. So this is a big win for me personally, because I've been saying for a long time that these are cross-cutting issues. And this is something that this book does very well. It paints that portrait. We also just had Dubai's COP28 that put the net zero path on the agenda in a big way. This goal to triple renewables by mid-century. And then next month, we're going to have the next COP that's going to set the stage for what will be the next round of emissions cutting actions nations will be doing. As we try to ever reach for these goals to net zero by 2050, we're likely to see a 2 to 8-fold increase in demand for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper, and all these things that will fuel our lives. The UN just agreed to this nice pact for the future, which underscores some of these themes that were brought out at Dubai. It reaffirmed those Dubai goals, but it didn't mention anything about critical resources. Even though the UN Secretary General did mention some of these things in his recent report. But anyway, I'd love to kick it off to Ernest, if there's anything I missed that folks should be aware of, and just setting like the scene setting or other things about the book you definitely would want me to highlight.
Hey, thanks, Martha. And it's great to be with you and New America and everyone joining us today virtually. Thanks for your time. I'm really thrilled to be able to share The War Below with you. And as you mentioned, the book is, yes, about critical minerals and our energy transition. But at its core, really, it's about community and choice. And you just laid bare, Martha, some of those choices that we face, especially now at this key inflection point. We see all around us the effects of climate change. One only needs to look at Florida yesterday with the hurricane that burrowed through the western, and then into the eastern part of the state there. One of the biggest storms ever to hit the state in recent recorded history. And we know that that's directly linked to climate change, and how we respond to this moment would be a direct reflection of the intrinsic value we put on our planet. And things like solar panels, wind turbines, et cetera, all have to be built with critical minerals that all come from somewhere. And so therein lies the concept of choice that I'm really bringing here to the audience with The War Below. I mean, what are the choices that we're willing to make in order to address climate change and have this energy transition? And I also would say that it's about many of the other electronic devices that are increasingly permeating our everyday lives. I mean, the cameras by which we're talking to each other right now, the microphones, all these virtual conferences that have become so commonplace are all due to technology that was not ubiquitous even 10 years ago. And so there's so much of our lives now that are increasingly powered by electronics built with critical minerals. So where all of these building blocks come from matter. And there are communities that live on the front line of these decisions that are directly affected. People that live near mine sites, or want mines in an area, but are facing opposition, legitimate or otherwise, from other communities that are out there. All of these communities and all of their voices matter. And it was my privilege to be able to tell their stories in The War Below, to really help the reader think through what she or he would want to do if they were policymakers, or perhaps to better understand the issue, to speak with one voice to their policymakers. Because right now, we're not really having these broad conversations about where and how we want to get these building blocks. And I really wrote the book to encourage that conversation. And I hope you mentioned COP28, Martha. I hope as we get to COP29 next month in Azerbaijan, that the discussion points around mining will actually be elevated so that it's even bigger part of the conversation. Because whether we like it or not, our climate change fight is intrinsically linked to mining. And so I really hope that the book becomes part of these broader conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree on all fronts. And I know I asked you to read an excerpt from your book that I particularly found really just an interesting juxtaposition of the kind of nexus challenges that you've mentioned.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do so. Just by way of a quick introduction. So, this excerpt that I'm going to read is at the end of a chapter about the Thacker Pass Lithium project. And I should say that each chapter in the book looks at a specific proposed project, some in the United States and some elsewhere. And yes, while each chapter does look at the history and the tension around a proposed project, each is actually more or less a theme. And so the theme that I'm exploring here in this chapter is one of deindustrialization. Should a way to fight climate change actually be for us to get rid of technology, to get rid of transportation devices like electric vehicles, or even just internal combustion vehicles, as a way, and return to an agrarian way of life? And there is a conservationist, an environmental advocate that I spent much of this chapter going to a proposed mine site known as Thacker Pass in northern Nevada. And this excerpt is me leaving him. And so happy to read these two paragraphs here. Cows were out for their morning jaunts as I drove away from Wilbert and into the Sunday morning sun. I turned on my radio but couldn't find any stations on the FM or AM dials. I kept driving for 20 minutes or so until I came to the small town of Overavar. The town's only school teaches students in kindergarten through 8th grade and sits right on the road leading out of a proposed mine site. Lithium Americas had promised to move the school at a cost of at least $10 million. With my gasoline tank running low and with me in desperate need of caffeine, I stopped at Orvada's Sawtooth Station, which sold Shell branded gasoline and potent Java. Toward the back of the lot on which Sawtooth sat, tucked in the rear corner and surrounded by green parking barricades, sat two EV charging stations. Here, in the middle of nowhere, next to one of North America's largest lithium supplies, the future had started to creep ever closer.
Yeah, I mean, I asked you to read that because it's this juxtaposition of how a lot of these mining sites are in just such hyper rural areas. Like you
Yes.
have to
Yep.
drive for miles and miles. There is no local hospital. You would if
Correct.
something bad happened to you, right?
Yes.
And clearly you traversed many of those miles to get these stories that are so integral to this work. Um, what was the most interesting place you spent time in for this book? And how did it influence the work?
Well, first off, Martha, I gotta say I loved all my places equally for the book. Um, but joking aside, I do have to say each sort of had its own stark beauty, and was honored to have the ability to spend much time proposed mine sites in the U.S. and then some internationally for this. That the site that this is based on, from the excerpt that I just read, was Thacker Pass. As I mentioned, it's in northern Nevada on the state's border with Oregon, and it was just beautiful. I mean, this is extremely rural, as you were saying, Martha, and it's a giant valley between two ancient mountain ranges, and there's a big lithium deposit in the valley between these two mountains. And for various geological reasons, there's a lot of lithium there, the largest supply on the North American continent. And just being there and walking around for about 2 or 3 hours with this conservationist, whose name is Max Wilbert, just really reinforced the stark beauty of this place. There was coyotes howling in the distance. At the sunset, you could see these beautiful hues of purple and orange and other colors in the sky. And not a lot of light pollution at all. In fact, earlier in the chapter, I made that reference that I've spent so much time, as unfortunately, perhaps many of us have, in urban areas, that I couldn't remember the last time that I had actually been in a place with very little light pollution, which was sort of fascinating for me to realize in that moment that I hadn't been there. So I just loved Thacker Pass and the ability to be there. And Nevada is just a beautiful state broadly. As part of the reporting for the book, I learned that more is known about Alaska than Nevada, which is sort of mind-boggling when you think about it. The flora and fauna of Alaska is more studied by botanists than that of Nevada, and it's just crazy. I think when people think of Nevada, they think of Las Vegas, but of course, that's just a small sliver of a very, very big state. So if you have occasion, or if your audience has occasion to explore Nevada, I highly recommend it.
Uh, yeah, I have not spent a lot of time in Nevada personally, but I have been to Vegas and I did see the oh, what was it? Like the Valley of Fire State Park and
Okay.
some of those
Okay.
other areas that are, I don't know.
Beautiful.
It's really beautiful and it's shocking how beautiful the desert can be. You're like, oh, it's so
Yep.
desperate. And
Yep.
being from the East Coast where everything is so green and then going out to the desert, it's just, I don't know. It's romanticized for a reason, right? Um,
Yes.
you've had this unique role. I mean, I don't think most people get to do what you've done in terms of getting to report on two big energy transitions, or at least two big inflection points with the shale boom, and now this critical resources boom for renewables. Are there any similarities or differences that stand out from these moments? And what can we learn from the shale boom to better inform this newest energy transition?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, Martha, I mean, my day job right now at Reuters, I write about critical minerals. And before that, I spent about 7 or 8 years writing about oil. And I started covering oil just as the shale boom was taking off in the United States. And that was a huge technological development powering an energy shift in our country. And so, for those who might not be completely familiar, I mean, when we say sort of the shale boom, essentially what we're referring to is a technological advancement in directional drilling. So the ability to sort of go down and then, excuse me, that would be my dog who is trying to become the star of the show. Um, and then also the ability to frack, which is sending high volumes of water down, and then basically lacing that water with chemicals that will extract oil. And so there's a huge, excuse me, 1 minute.
No worries. Um,
He he is determined to be the star of the show. Um, And so fracking made a huge technological improvement to the United States' ability to produce its own oil. There were a lot of fascinating things as a journalist to cover out of that. And I actually spent 2 years living in North Dakota writing about how fracking was revolutionizing that state's economy and really making North Dakota a bigger oil producer than some OPEC nations. And with critical minerals, obviously very much still under the energy umbrella, but there's a huge energy and technological connection there as well. Certainly, we know that electric vehicles require inordinately higher amounts of critical minerals than the internal combustion engine. But certainly, and I referenced this earlier in the conversation, things like laptops, cell phones, etc., are increasingly being large users of these critical minerals, and so I definitely see a lot of overlaps there. I will say, Martha, that one difference I saw between covering oil and gas and critical minerals is how average consumers connect or relate to the industry. Whereas with oil and gas, I tended to see people fall in one of two camps when it came to oil or fossil fuels in general. Either they saw fossil fuels as being an important economic boost for only a country in our world and raising standard of living, or I saw that oil and gas is having a deleterious effect on our economy and our environment. People tend to fall into one or two camps there. But when it comes to critical minerals, I saw the reaction a little bit more muddled. Folks would say, sure, yeah, I think electric vehicles are fine. Cool. You want to put a solar panel on your roof? Okay. But when it came to the specific building blocks, the sources of those building blocks for those devices, we're going to put a mine here, Martha, in your backyard or near where you went camping as a child, et cetera, et cetera. That's where a lot of the opposition would percolate up. And when you sort of add the opposition up at each proposed mine site, I became very curious about, okay, well, where are we going to get the building blocks for all of these energy transition devices and get the volumes that the IEA and other intergovernmental organizations say we're going to need? And so that is really sparked the genesis for me for the War Below, that exploration of that choice there, and that led to the narrative that we all have here that's in front of you.
well, um, lovely. I mean, so many good points there. Yeah, I can definitely see that. People are for energy transition. It's the answer. It's the only way we're going to deal with our climate reality. But it's, I guess it's going to be more driven. The equity challenges will be more driven from the ground up rather than top down, or even just us and the choices that we make about, the car we may buy. In
Yes.
chapter 4, the leaf blower, I have to say, when I first saw the kind of index or table of contents, I thought leaf blower, why is this in here? And then as I read the chapter, I was like, of course, like this makes sense. You go into the challenges that people face once they ask where something comes from. And a leaf blower, is something that folks use quite a bit here stateside. Um, the EU has kind of a suite of new like supply chain requirements that are now effective via their CSRD and some other related policies. And there are so many other voluntary things that companies may opt to do. Do you see this question becoming easier to answer in the years ahead?
Ooh, that's a big question, Martha. Just by way of quick background, so when I was writing the book, the number one question I got was, okay, it sounds like it's about electric vehicles. I don't own an electric vehicle. I don't know if I'd be interested. So a few years ago, I was meeting up with a very close friend who suddenly decided to go on a screed against leaf blowers. And it was fascinating for me. I hadn't really known that much about this war against leaf blowers. And so I started digging in. And one of the many reasons that people are opposed to leaf blowers is because historically they're powered by two-stroke engines, which basically emit this noxious, nasty crap, for lack of a better term, that makes climate change worse. And so the answer, many are saying, including some governments that are outlawing two-stroke engine powered leaf blowers, the answer is to go electric and to get an electric leaf blower. And so that's why I put this chapter into the book. While I was writing the book, I was got a house and got a backyard of my own, so I got an electric leaf blower. I thought, why not? And that led me down a rabbit hole of, okay, if getting an electric powered leaf blower is actually better for the planet than one powered by a two-stroke engine, where do all the critical minerals come from? How do I ensure that the copper was ethically sourced, or at least the way that the copper was produced didn't emit a bunch of pollutants that make climate change worse? And I have to tell you, Martha, I have a lot of resources at my disposal, especially even my day job. I couldn't figure out where any of the critical minerals came from in this leaf blower, which is powered by a lithium ion battery. Couldn't figure out where the copper came from. Couldn't figure out if the lithium had come from northern Chile, which is a pretty popular production site. But then typically it's sent across the Pacific Ocean to a cathode facility, and then maybe back across the Pacific Ocean to a hardware store where I bought it. So that's across the Pacific Ocean twice. There's a lot of emissions there just from transportation. I couldn't figure out if the cobalt was taken out of the ground by a young child in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which sadly does happen more often than we would like to admit as consumers. And there's virtually no way to track the provenance of cobalt. It's a huge issue for the cobalt industry right now. That there are issues, I should say, there are attempts being made to abrogate that, but it can be hard to track the provenance of cobalt. And those are just three examples right there. And that's just for a leaf blower. Now you sort of magnify the issue across many household appliances that are increasingly powered by lithium ion batteries, putting aside just even electric vehicles and all these other energy transition devices. And then I think it really lays bare the stark challenges around supply chains and why these things matter. So for me, the transparency around the supply chain goes hand in hand with understanding this choice that we talked about earlier. And so you asked about these governmental transparency schemes. And I think increasingly, Martha, we're going to see host governments across the world, as well as consumer groups, demand more transparency around the provenance of these critical minerals for products that consumers buy every single day. A great example, I mean, right now, if you buy an internal combustion engine vehicle, I mean, what's sort of the main metric you might look at? Miles per gallon. Typically that is a thing you look for on a car lot. I'm curious and perhaps even convinced that increasingly consumers are going to demand information on the total carbon footprint for an electric vehicle's production, as well as perhaps maybe the provenance for where some of the critical minerals comes from. And we're already seeing some manufacturers take steps in this direction. So one of the chapters I have in the book looks at the creation of IRMA, or the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, that looks to bolster the practices of the mining industry by setting high standards. And it's not an agency linked to the mining industry or the environmental industry or the investor community or the indigenous community. It's actually representative of all of those and more folks that came together and said, what are the best practices for running a mine so that we can help ensure that level or increase that level of transparency around supply chains for these critical minerals. You did mention the efforts in Europe to increase transparency, and we're already seeing the positive effects of that. But if the implicit promise of the energy transition is that we're doing better things for the planet, then the supply chains, especially around the critical minerals, has got to follow suit. And I think increasingly we're going to see push from government as well as consumers in that direction.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, folks want to know where their stuff's coming from and
Yes.
understand that EVs and decarbonized technologies are the path forward, and they want to know where it's sourced, right? Um, a little known and seemingly ancient law regulates U.S. mining, the 1872 mining law. This is a very catchy name for a piece of legislation.
It's specific.
Right? You know the
Yes.
year, you know what it's about. Quick and easy, right? It's become an interesting inflection point for US-based mining, mentioned throughout the book in different examples of a lot of things are proposed and not very many things have actually come online when it comes to lithium, copper, rare earth mining. What do you see as the biggest fault lines of this 152-year-old law? Or actually, no, I'm sorry. I'm trapped in a different century. Did I do the math right? Maybe I didn't. That's fine. I don't do math. This really old law. And
You're
is
right.
it still fit? Am I right? Okay. Is it still fit for purpose?
Well, let's just start where at the beginning, Martha. I mean, so the law was signed by President Ulysses S. Grant. to increase the population of the US West. So this is a law that governs much of the hard rock mining in the US West. Now, the law clearly was in the years after the Civil War designed to get a lot of Americans just to leave the East and go to what is modern California, Oregon, Washington State, etc., and yes, Nevada. That area, of course, not nearly as populated as it is today. Now, I wasn't around when Grant was president, but I feel very confident saying that the law did not envision our modern electronic reality. It didn't even envision cars. Cars were not invented in 1872. And the law had a lot of sweeteners in there as part of that drive to increase the population in the US West, one of which is being that mining companies, if they stake a claim on a deposit on US federal land, do not need to pay royalties to the US federal government. And now I can tell you, Martha, that oil companies do, and they would kill for that kind of perk. They got to pay 8% royalty to federal coffers when they take oil out of federal lands. And so mining companies do not have to do that. And so you can begin to see right away why mining, if you can get a permit, is a very lucrative activity if you're mining on US federal land. And so the law, I would argue, has achieved its purpose. The US West, of course, California is the most populated US state. Obviously, the huge chunks of the U.S. West have a lot of people, which is a conversation for another day. But the law has achieved its intended effect. And so, what does it look like to have a mining law that reflects the realities of the 21st century economy? We're not really having that debate really either now. It's not part of the conversation in Washington. It's not really a conversation in our current U.S. presidential election cycle. We've had several references to climate on the periphery, but we've not really even had climate be a core issue here in this campaign. And I would argue, certainly in the book, that a climate discussion has to involve a discussion around where we're going to get the building blocks for critical minerals. And those aren't part of the discussions here right now. So yes, this law has been around since 1872, and it's changed very little since then. I mean, it's been some nips and tugs on the edges, but at its core, it's still the law that governs this hard rock mining. And so I would, say, what could it look like to have an updated law? I mean, perhaps this is a discussion that we as voters should be encouraging our policymakers to address more, especially as we go forward in this 21st century.
Yeah, for sure. And as I know, we both have mentioned like the importance of these UN climate conferences. The last one, COP28 in Dubai, this goal to triple renewables is a big deal to meet net zero targets. With the exception of a copper mine in Nevada that opened in like 2019, the US hasn't opened any new critical resource mines in decades,
Right.
despite our longstanding emission reduction goals, and all the suite of incentives for renewable expansion and decarbonization efforts embedded within the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, in addition to even like some of the things in the CHIPS Act and in the Infrastructure Act also do some of this. I just refer to them as the Biden bills because it's too much of a mouthful otherwise. But we also have a huge demand. Like the US, we are the biggest consumers of everything on the planet. So that includes renewables and other emerging technologies. After all these things, post Dubai, post IRA, do you see an increased likelihood the US will open more of these critical resource mines?
Well, certainly we know that the aims of the BIL and the IRA and other pieces of legislation are going to require more critical minerals. And part of what I explore in the book is the attempts by some to build more mines and coming up against tension from folks that have many legitimate reasons to oppose these projects. And so I'm sort of asking the question, if these are our goals, what are the choices we're going to make on standards? Because not having those standards, not having discussions, for instance, on 1872 or the federal permitting review process or other related areas means that we're not able to actually decide, okay, are we going to have enough of these critical minerals within our own borders to achieve these goals? Martha, it's actually very unclear right now how to get to a firm yes or a firm no when it comes to an extractive mining permit in the United States. And I think that ambiguity is not in line or does not line up, to word it better, with the goal or the spirit of the BIL and the IRA and other pieces of federal legislation. We know we can't have an Inflation Reduction Act without more critical minerals. That's just a reality. And then there's also a layer of geopolitics involved here, which I think maybe we'll get to in a few minutes, is that there are countries out there willing to corner the control of these critical minerals markets for their own ends. China being one a country that has been very open about extending its control over the rare earths, over the graphite, over the germanium, over the gallium, over the lithium markets, and then using that control as economic weapons for its own purposes. And so whoever controls the production and processing of these critical minerals really will control the 21st century economy the way that crude oil defined the 20th century economy. And so these are part of the things that we've got to be discussing as well. We know that the United States does not necessarily have all of the critical minerals that it will need within its own borders, but it has plenty of allies that do have those. And we also know that unlike fossil fuels, which are burned off during combustion, all critical minerals can be recycled. Lithium does not lose its ability to hold a charge in a battery just because it's been sitting in an old battery for 20 years. You can recycle and reprocess that battery and reuse that lithium again and again and again. So that's a huge benefit for the energy transition here as well. And that means that at some point, we don't know when, but at some point, we'll dig the last mine. But we have to actually get to that point first.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be great if we could dig the last mine before we drill the last barrel of oil. Um, Fingers crossed.
We'll see.
Um, with, I mean, we've been seeing kind of as a way to protect domestic production or domestic workers, a lot of recent EU and US trade tariffs on EVs and other critical resources from China. I just saw earlier this week, China just issued some tariffs against EU goods or European goods as a way to kind of rebuff this. Um, there's also competition between Western and Chinese mining companies that illustrate your book, specifically around cobalt. Um, do you think we're in a kind of economic Cold War with China over the energy transition?
Well, I'm going to let others maybe say if we're in sort of a cold conflict with Beijing or not. What I will say is that it's very obvious based on steps that China has taken, and let's say they did in the past 12 months, to stop the export of rare earth processing technology, to limit exports of graphite. And graphite, while maybe not as widely known as lithium or copper, is actually the biggest part of an EV battery by volume. Graphite is typically used to make an anode. Not to get too geeky, but a battery has two parts: a cathode and an anode. And graphite, it goes most often in the anode, and it's for better or worse, you need a lot of graphite. And so China is limiting exports of that, as well as some minor metals known as germanium and gallium. And those are just sort of seen as opening volleys and what is expected to be limitations of other exports in the future. China is the world's largest lithium processor. Huge American lithium companies like Albemarle and Arcadium have big processing facilities in mainland China. And that's partly because the biggest EV market right now is mainland China. And so there's a huge lever of economic control that China has there over this huge growth area in our global economy, and that is linked to the energy transition. And so China's been very willing to do that. And so you see efforts by the Inflation Reduction Act and other pieces of U.S. legislation to increase that supply chain outside the United States, not necessarily to sort of thwart China's aims, but to sort of increase what's going on in the United States and with allied partners. And so, time will tell if those can be successful. But I think where we are right now is seeing that we have to be actually thinking about where we want to get this stuff. And I think the era of just expecting stuff to show up at our door without thinking through the provenance of that, I think that's over. And I think that really got legs underneath it. That idea got legs underneath it due to the coronavirus pandemic. It was 4.5 years ago, Martha, that many folks, especially in the United States, realized that our country did not make masks anymore. That sort of most basic yet essential piece of medical equipment that really helped to get us through that horrible pandemic. Now you sort of extrapolate that across the energy transition, and you realize that many of the building blocks for this energy transition are actually not even made in the United States or in many countries in the West. They're made elsewhere. And so those are hugely long supply chains that can be disrupted by armed conflict, by weather, by something else. And so where these products are made matters, and where the building blocks for them are made matters. And if the goal of the energy transition is partly to reduce carbon emissions, well, then having a more regional production also should help with that goal as well. So these are some of the points that I'm hoping to spark conversation with in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should all in the international policy research space, we should all be talking about this much more than we are. And it's, the critical resources piece has been largely divorced from a lot of climate conversations. In chapter 8, Rebirth, you tell the story of antimony and how
Mm.
it was vital for the Allied war effort in World War II. And there's like a distinct national security dynamic to these mines. It's not just for all the wonderful things that we're hoping to use in a green economy, like better technologies and solar panels and better, more efficient EV batteries and the like, or even some of the new AI technologies, right?
Yep.
These elements are also relied on for national defense. What do you think we can learn from the antimony story for critical resource security today? And this kind of unique juxtaposition we're in around climate solutions that we need to like do at speed and at scale.
Sure. So that chapter, Martha, that you're referring to around antimony, so it's not as maybe popular a critical mineral as say cobalt or nickel, but for me, the story of this project, the stibnite mine in northern Idaho, was actually really intriguing that I wanted to explore with the reader. I mentioned that each chapter has a theme, and this chapter, Rebirth, looks at the idea of a brownfield mine. A brownfield, is sort of industry jargon, but basically, it's a site that had been a mine in the past. And the question here is, could it be repurposed for 21st century needs? So this was a mine that supplied antimony during World War II, and it was developed very quickly in the era before the U.S. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, had been created. And so many of the decisions that were made around that mine perhaps would not be made today if the mine were being freshly dug. And so that was part of the harmful environmental legacy that has been left with that mine. It was a Superfund site. And yet, though, there's still a lot of antimony there as well as a lot of gold. And so you get to meet during the chapter a executive as part of this company that would like to develop the mine. They just want permission, not only A, to get the permits, but also B, to ensure that what's known as Good Samaritan legislation gets passed. The idea that they don't want to be held responsible for something that they didn't do. And so this is, you get to meet during that chapter, sort of the journey of this project. Now, I should say antimony actually has been an area that China's dominated for 100 years. Even during World War II, I mean, the reason why this mine was developed so quickly, just, put your history hat on, is, when Japan invaded China, there was huge concerns that these antimony supplies could be cut off. And antimony is used as a flame retardant. Essentially, you can add it to coatings for ships. You can make bullets with it. You have a whole host of military applications. So you can see right away why the Pentagon wants this mine reopened. And the question is, can we repurpose an old site? If there are some places too special to mine that are pristine, okay, then maybe we shouldn't build a mine there. But if here you have a mine that had been one already and it's just been sitting fallow for decades, could it be reopened? And you get to explore that possibility in this chapter, because there's actually a lot of proposed mine sites across North America that had been mines in the past, and could they be repurposed today? So that's the question that I'm bringing there to the reader with the chapter, and also perhaps sort of just encouraging people to learn a little bit more about antimony, which is not, as I say, as popular as some of the other critical minerals out there.
Yeah, well, you didn't have a favorite location you went to, but maybe you have a favorite critical mineral. Um,
I love all my critical minerals equally as well. So
love it. Just when you think about the mass of minerals that we'll need to get to net zero, it will be less than the coal that we mine in a single year, or at least mined last year. We just think about the volume of something, right? And we can recycle it to death if we have the skill and know-how. In chapter 12, The Entrepreneur, you tell this story of two colleagues who created Li-Cycle. Um,
Mhm.
and it's now recycling more lithium than the US mines annually. So, like, kind of amazing. Could we eventually recycle our way to net zero and circularity? Is this a way for us to have our energy transition and secure biodiversity too?
That's the $1 trillion question, right? I think anyone that says they know when we're going to get to this idea of a truly circular economy isn't speaking with full confidence. And just to back up a little bit here, I mean, the phrase circular economy references the idea that at some point, like I was mentioning earlier, we'll dig that last mine, and all these old devices that are out there powered by lithium-ion batteries can be recycled so that the critical minerals inside them can be repurposed and reused. When we're going to actually hit that tipping point, I don't think anyone knows. I know that there has been some estimates that maybe it could be 2050, maybe 2075, maybe past 2100. But what we do know is that we're going to need to increase our production of critical minerals for the foreseeable future. And so it's very much unclear when we'd dig that last mine. But we do know that we have to increase our use of recycling. So I want to make a confession, Martha, and I actually think I'm going to drag you into this as well. Um, I have a drawer full of old cell phones, and I'm sure you do too. I'm sure many of us do. And those are just cell phones just sitting there. And I think about the other electronic devices that you might have sitting in a closet somewhere, all of them powered by lithium ion batteries. All of those devices can and should be recycled. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, lithium does not lose its ability to retain a charge just because it's been sitting in a cell phone for 20 years, or any lithium ion battery for that matter. And so the more we exercise this muscle around recycling, the closer we're going to get to that idea of net zero. And what was so intriguing to me about that chapter, The Entrepreneur, was looking at two individuals who started recycling companies, each with perhaps different business strategies, but with the same end goal in mind there to sort of encourage more mass adoption of recycling out there. And I don't think we have that muscle memory developed in the United States or really in the rest of the world right now for turning in old devices and having them be repurposed and reused. And we sort of do in other areas. So think about lead acid batteries, which are very common for internal combustion engines right now. I mean, when that battery dies, what you might not realize is that the ecosphere has been developed over decades to basically take that old battery and take the parts apart and basically build new batteries. And what you don't realize is you actually pay a small percentage when you buy a new lead acid battery that keeps that whole system churning in the background. And so the question that I'm bringing in that chapter to the reader is, are there ways that maybe that could work for the lithium ion battery industry? And there's no sort of standardization yet, but I think we're moving in that direction. And so that's a concept that I bring there to the reader as well.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, my other half and I did scour our home for all the all the random old junk technology we had, and found places to recycle that. But it was hard.
Excellent.
It took us like 3 months to actually get rid of everything. We just had this like perpetual corner of malaise and it's filled with things. It's like slowly whittling down. Um, It'd be nice if there were an easier way. I know New York City has a lot of different drop-off things, but not everything is for, like, some people don't want your lithium ion batteries because they're combustible.
They can be, yes, which is a concept I explore in that chapter as well, and maybe we'll leave that as a little tease for our audience to go explore that chapter.
You got to read the book to find out more. Um,
Exactly.
um, I think something that came out during like the UNGA period that was such a blur during Climate Week UNGA. September is like a month of just too many things. But the UN Secretary General came out with that report on critical resources, specifically highlighting the human rights concerns and kind of setting a list of priorities or guidelines In chapter 3, Radical Work, you kind of talk about the genesis of IRMA, or the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. Um, do you think these guidelines will potentially influence existing mechanisms like this?
Oh, well, maybe, which is not a
Yeah.
direct answer. I know, but part of the reason why I wanted to include Irma in the book was because I didn't want the reader to sort of get stressed out or just feel at a loss around these tough choices that we face, and then think that there's not much going on by way of trying to address some of these issues. And Irma's genesis actually came out of the private industry because many people that buy critical minerals, including Tiffany, you get to find out in that chapter why Tiffany and Company, the jeweler, helped create IRMA. They were saying, okay, how do we make sure that the supply chain for critical minerals is as transparent, as safe as it possibly can be? And many governments across the world have tried to take a bite at this apple, and some have succeeded and some have not. So IRMA was one, what's known as a certification scheme designed to address this. Now, certainly there are many other certification schemes out there as well, and different people have taken different approaches to this. But IRMA has got the support of Tesla, of Microsoft, of the Ford Foundation, of Ford, of Patagonia, of many other manufacturers saying that they are going to support this. And so that's why it was very intriguing for me to sort of have that in there and tell that story. But I think the more that consumers demand this of their manufacturers, the better, because we don't really, and of course we have what, more than 150 countries in the world, and so expecting there to be 150 mining certification schemes based on government principles is perhaps not realistic. But if you have an industry that buys critical minerals, telling the mining industry that we want to follow certain standards, could that be a way to increase transparency? It's an interesting question, and I wanted to explore it in the chapter, as well as get to meet some of the people behind it. So you get to meet the former CEO of Tiffany and Company, who really pushed for the certification scheme. You get to meet the head of IRMA, who really, she's gone out of her way to really push this transparency advocacy on the industry. And you get to meet a few other interesting people as well there.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We have a couple more questions before we move to audience questions. So,
Sure.
folks, make sure you pop those into the chat. Um, you know, Mining is really about this relationship with water. And this relationship you illustrate in many of the chapters in the book, from resolution copper to twin metals. And these are just a couple different of the projects you highlight. But what about this dynamic stands out the most to you as a challenge or opportunity?
Well, there's no way around the fact that mining is just extremely water intensive. You need a lot of water depending on the metal. I mean, the volumes can differ, but water is a key part of the production process. And you can imagine if you're in a very arid place, like parts of Mongolia, like parts of Arizona, or sort of elsewhere in the world, that becomes a key challenge, especially around mines that are near population centers. So Arizona, New Mexico, for instance, have a lot of copper mines, but they also have, Albuquerque, Phoenix, Tucson, et cetera. So you set up a tension point right from the beginning there. There are also parts of the world that have large metals deposits, but might be near large bodies of water. And so one of the chapters in the book, I explore the Twin Metals Project, which is in northern Minnesota, right on the edge, essentially, of a watershed that feeds the Great Lakes. And so therein lies sort of a tension right there. You have plenty of water, but the potential, and if there's an accident, to cause pollution that would affect that extremely large body of water is immense there. And so these are some of the tension points that I'm exploring there in the narrative. I will say that people near mine sites and proposed mine sites are very aware of the linkage that water has to the mining industry. Folks in Arizona recognize that, hey, they're in an arid place, so you should go mine in northern Minnesota where there's plenty of water. But then folks in northern Minnesota would tell me, hey, the potential for a catastrophe is too great here. You should go mine in the Southwest where you're not going to accidentally pollute a large body of water. And I actually heard that time and time again while reporting out the book. So water, to your point, Martha, is extremely linked to the entire mining supply chain, and it's got to be part of the conversations here as well.
Yeah. You've interviewed so many folks, like mining execs, activists, and all these, community folks who are on the front lines. And we've talked a lot about, some of these global forums like the UN and yada yada. Um, what could global forums do to better align towards solutions that can protect the environment and communities, avoid resource curse, all while providing the resources we'll need for this century's energy transition?
Well, I should say, he's going to steal the show anyhow. So Theo would like to say he's happy to be here. So I'm supposed to be sleeping through this, so I apologize to our audience. But he's here. I will say, Martha. I mean, to me, it's about speaking us as everyday citizens, speaking with our policymakers, including in intergovernmental organizations, with I'm not necessarily I'll say one voice, but at least with a more educated and informed approach. Because at the end of the day, these policymakers take their cues from us, the voters and other citizens of the world. And I don't think we're speaking with one voice now in a way that we might on parallel issues, say climate change. I mean, I think people do tend to have very strong opinions on climate change and speak directly to policymakers around these areas. But when it comes to actual critical minerals, which is the bedrock, if you'll forgive the pun, really of how we fight climate change, they're not really speaking with one voice or even perhaps being as educated as they could be. So I think it starts with an educated populace and an educated citizenry that's willing to talk to many of these policymakers, whether in the US government or other Western governments or any government really, or any other intergovernmental organization, and to say, here's how we feel like we should approach these topics. Many of the issues that I talk about in the book don't have easy black or white answers. They're very sticky. And I wanted the audience to have to sit in the middle of that stickiness and to decide where they would go. And I purposely don't put my opinion in the book as to whether I support or oppose many of these extractive projects, because I wanted the audience to have to, as I say, sit in that stickiness. The one main argument that I do make is that we've got to be making a choice. And indecision is a choice here. And so I really want folks to have to grapple with this and think through all sides. And I think being able to do that and then speak to our policymakers about this is the best way for us to get through this situation.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to some audience questions.
Sure.
All of them are from Anonymous. Not like the group Anonymous, just the folks that decided not to name themselves. Some experts argue that oil is cleaner than mining. How do we ensure critical minerals extraction and processing doesn't make the climate crisis worse?
Great question. Thanks for that. I think it gets back to transparency. We were talking about the leaf blower earlier, and I couldn't figure out where the copper or other critical minerals came from that powered that device. So I had no clue really if it was taken out of the ground in a production process powered by coal, for instance. I had no clue. So I think the more we have transparency around the entire supply chain, we're able to get to that greater level of confidence that indeed we are actually doing something better for the environment.
Yeah. This question's interesting. I'm gonna ask it as they've written it.
Okay.
So do you think the US has the capability to block the channel to deliver lithium, copper, and so on to China if it later attacks Taiwan? So I think maybe what they're referencing is because we rely on these things from China right now. So
Sure.
maybe they meant the inverse. I'm not sure, but maybe you have some thoughts on the China-Taiwan critical resources dynamics that might be emerging.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think I might put aside the potential conflict, just for the moment, and just say in general, the U.S. and Chinese economies are extremely intertwined and are very linked. But we do know that China has signaled its willingness to stop the exports of certain technologies and certain critical minerals. And so the question has come up in certain circles: if there is any kind of armed conflict and those exports are shut off, what could that mean for the US economy and especially the US military? So these are questions that many people are beginning to ask with increasingness across Washington and elsewhere.
Yeah. Last question from the audience. What role can private industry play, in addition to the ones in the book, of course, in the recycling of batteries? Like, what more can they be doing?
Sure. So there are actually many, many different types of chemistries used to make lithium ion batteries. So some of these acronyms might be familiar to some folks in the audience. LFP is one that's really common out there. It's made with iron. There is also NCM or others that are out there. And basically, at the end of the day, they're just sort of different components of critical minerals that make up different chemical compositions for a battery. Now, why did I say that? Because how you recycle them, it can be a little bit different depending on the chemistry. So, how we get to some kind of standardization, if we get to some kind of standardization, I'm sort of curious about what that could mean for wider adoption of recycling down the line, or maybe even streamlining the recycling process on the back end. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to happen, but I think I'm sort of intrigued of what that means. Now, different manufacturers prefer different chemistries for various different reasons. LFP tends to be cheaper, and if you're trying to make a electric vehicle that is cheaper, which many people want, certainly LFP is the way to go, but it can be extremely hard to recycle an LFP lithium ion battery. So I know that's a little geeky and nerding out there, but could there be a standardization in how these batteries are even made, and what could that mean for recycling down the line? I'm curious about what that could mean for our EV future.
Yeah, we did get some additional questions. I'm just
Sure.
going to ask one. It's the last one, from Kai. How does, if at all, critical minerals extraction clash with Indigenous rights and sovereignty across the
Okay.
globe?
Yeah, Kai, great question. I would definitely refer you to chapter 2 of the book, which actually is the longest chapter in the book. It looks at the Resolution Copper project in Arizona, near a town called Superior, about an hour east of Phoenix. And this is a historical site and historical religious site for the San Carlos Apache people, where many of them worship their deities and hold special ceremonies for teenage girls and other members of their community. The tension point right from the beginning of that chapter is you learn that a giant copper deposit, one of the largest really in the world, sits underneath that religious holy site. And mining companies that would like to develop it do have permission from the US federal government, but to do the extraction would cause a giant hole that would essentially destroy that Native American holy site. And so right away, that theme that I'm exploring in that chapter is, do religious rights matter more than the energy transition? Do indigenous rights matter more than the energy transition? Can they both coexist? And if so, what could that look like? And it was really my honor and privilege to spend time with folks on all sides of that very, very complex issue, to bring them to you, the reader, and sort of explore it with you.
Yeah. Thank you for answering all those questions. Ernest, do you have any final thoughts or something you want to expand on before I close this out?
Sure. Well, Martha, I just want to thank you and New America and everyone for joining us today. And Theo, as you can see, he's very happy to be with us here as well. I really wrote this book really to help bring these issues of community and choice to the reader, because I wanted uh, these issues to be part of our common collective conversation in the United States and elsewhere. And we're really not having them now. And I feel very passionately that any conversation about climate has to involve a conversation around extraction and where we get the building blocks for our everyday lives. We're not really having those discussion points now, and I really hope The War Below helps prod these broader discussions around where and how we want to get the lithium and copper, cobalt and nickel, and other building blocks for our everyday lives. And so the more that we debate these, the more that we can actually get to a common understanding of what we expect, and then we can move forward to address climate change, which is one of the serious issues of our time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ernest. It was so lovely to chat with you. And thank you to the audience and our comms team here who kind of brought everything together for us logistically. Um, Folks, you should make sure that you check out this book. You can find it both on Simon & Schuster's website as well as on Ernest's own website. You can go to www.ernestscheiter.com /about or /the war below. and find out more. But Ernest, it was such a delight to talk to you about these points of tension, between mining, climate, communities, water, biodiversity. These are all the challenges that we have to face ahead of us. I appreciate that your book didn't throw around too many opinions and let us, as the reader, think and consider, because these are really, these are challenges. And just because it's sticky and difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't face them head on. So I hope that your book inspires more conversations around the critical resources that will predicate whether or not we actually achieve our climate targets and have a habitable future for us all. So thank you so much.
Thank you much, Martha. Have a great afternoon.
You too.